all the body language that is not in a positive way.
He just phenomenal athlete. It feels like he still has that lunch pail mentality a little bit.
A mother saw the wreck before anyone else did. Inside her family documentary, Virginia Garcia said one quiet thing that now haunts every frame. She begged the world not to turn her son into a broken toy. Back then it sounded like love. Today, one veteran tennis expert looked at the same young man and sat there shocked. On July 28th, Riyadh booked Carlos Alcaraz into a $6 million exhibition. Days before, London's Laver Cup had claimed his seat too. His wrist has not survived a competitive point since April. Then the buried truth slipped out. This decision to stack paydays onto a raw injury never came from a doctor's mouth. It came from home. Alcaraz's father rules the guarded circle where every move is chosen, and it was made without his medical team ever holding the pen. The people paid to protect him were never asked. If stories buried beneath the scoreline move you, subscribe now and let us bring you the ones that matter. So did the family that built this champion just gamble with the very thing they swore to guard? What surfaces next will unsettle you? She feared that pen more than any rival her son would ever meet across a net. Not the racket in his grip, but the quieter instrument that decides where that grip gets sent, how often it gets sent there, and at what cost to a body still stitching itself back together. To grasp why a parent's private dread has hardened into something resembling a warning label, the calendar has to be rewound to a single afternoon that guillotined an entire season without warning. It happened on the 14th of April, on home soil, at the Barcelona Open. That means more to Carlos Alcaraz than almost any stop outside the four majors. While returning a serve against Finland's Otto Virtanen, something gave way inside his right wrist. He gritted through the discomfort and closed out the victory, and that competitive stubbornness masked how deep the damage actually ran. The scans ordered the following day delivered a verdict nobody in his camp wanted spoken aloud. The diagnosis was tenosynovitis, an inflammation of the tendon sheath that wraps the wrist. Clinically, the term sounds almost minor. Its practical meaning is anything but small. Grip strength and rotation are the first casualties of that particular condition, and those two forces happen to be exactly what an elite forehand demands. Consider how this man strikes a tennis ball. Few players alive generate the racket head speed he produces, and fewer still layer that violence with the heavy topspin that became his calling card. Every whipped forehand loads the wrist joint like a spring wound past its safe tolerance. The injury, framed honestly, was not some freak stroke of bad luck. It read more like an invoice presented for a lifetime of hitting the way he hits. What made the early days worse was the spin placed on the news. His camp initially described the problem as something modest, a precaution rather than a crisis, and that framing collapsed almost immediately. The sheer haste with which he abandoned tournament after tournament betrayed a truth the reassuring language tried to hide. A cascade of withdrawals rolled out, each heavier than the one before it. His hometown Madrid Open vanished from the schedule first. Rome slipped away shortly afterward, and the defense of his Roland Garros crown evaporated too, the very title he had wrestled from Jannik Sinner 12 months earlier across 5 grueling hours in Paris. Grass offered no mercy either. Queens dropped off the board, with Wimbledon following it into the void, which marked the first calendar year since 2020 in which he would sit out a pair of Grand Slams. The absence carried a visible and immediate price. Alexander Zverev climbed over him into the world's number 2 position, and in a twist that surely stung, the German then seized the Roland Garros trophy that Alcaraz never got the chance to protect. Sinner, for his part, quietly defended his Wimbledon title while the Spaniard watched from a couch. The tour pressed forward without him, as indifferent to reputation as it has always been, and by the time the hard courts arrived, he had slipped to third in the rankings behind 2 men who kept accumulating what he could only forfeit. Understand the biology and the caution starts to make sense. A wrist afflicted by tenosynovitis typically needs somewhere between 3 and 6 months to settle, and even that window assumes the patient resists the temptation to hurry. Push too soon and the inflammation flares straight back, often angrier than before. The joint sends no honest signal until it is asked to bear real load at real speed. which means a player can feel perfectly fine in gentle practice and still be nowhere near ready for the specific torture of a live match. Layer onto that the cruel arithmetic of ranking points. Alcaraz had 3,000 of them to defend from the previous summer's Cincinnati and US Open haul, a mountain of a total that would crumble if he stayed sidelined, dragging him further down the order. Two competing pressures therefore sat on his shoulders at once. One whispered patience, the other screamed about points draining away by the week. Throughout the ordeal, the words coming out of his mouth stayed measured and admirably mature. He talked about the decades still ahead of him, about the folly of trading a long future for one impatient present. Those sentiments were genuine, and they represented precisely the perspective a young champion ought to carry into a serious injury. A sentence delivered into a press conference microphone and a contract initialed behind a closed door, though, do not always sing the same melody. That thin distance between the public voice and the private signature is where this entire story quietly bends. How he spent the recovery only deepened the strangeness. Rather than vanishing into a monastic rehabilitation bubble, Alcaraz lived through what Spanish reporters described as the freest and oddest summer of his career. He flew to the United States and stood on the pitch at the World Cup final, carrying the trophy after his nation lifted the crown, spotted by sharp-eyed fans wearing a protective support on the very wrist supposedly demanding rest and quiet. Holidays, celebrations, and a general air of ease filled the months when many expected grim, grinding recovery work. There is nothing sinister in a young man enjoying his life, and the freedom may well have been prescribed as mental medicine. Yet the loose, unhurried mood of that summer sat oddly beside a schedule that would soon demand the exact opposite from his body. Consider next the man charged with mending the wrist, because his identity raises the stakes considerably. Alcaraz entrusted his recovery to Angel Ruiz Cotoro, the Barcelona specialist whose name is woven through modern tennis history. This is the physician who kept Rafael Nadal upright across seasons that should have finished him. The doctor who once numbed the nerves inside Nadal's ravaged foot, so that a 14th Roland Garros could be claimed on a joint riddled with an incurable condition. Around the sport's inner rooms, he carries an almost mythic reputation, the healer credited with buying champions extra years they had no right to expect. From June deep into July, he ran his scans, examined the tendon, and tracked its slow repair. Following a stretch of guarded silence, his assessment landed with real weight. The wrist, he judged, had fully healed. On paper, that reads like the credits rolling on a feel-good comeback film. In reality, it was nothing of the kind. A tendon pronounced structurally sound and a tendon braced to withstand the savagery of top-flight tennis occupy two entirely separate universes, and the chasm dividing them is precisely where promising careers get quietly buried. The medical staff understood that danger down to the marrow. When Ruiz Cotoro handed over his encouraging read, the response from the players' circle bent toward restraint rather than celebration. Montreal's Canadian Open was struck from the plan without a second thought. Cincinnati got penciled in as a gentler doorway back, with the US Open positioned as the genuine prize waiting beyond it. Alcaraz himself characterized that Montreal withdrawal as a conclusion reached together with his team. Prudence carried the argument. The people in the lab coats held their line, and for a moment the whole apparatus appeared to be pulling in one careful direction. Hold that tableau still for a beat, because the contrast about to arrive is jarring. A watchful medical unit, a doctor famous for stretching a legend's shelf life well past its natural expiry. An athlete evangelizing patience at every available microphone. Each observable signpost pointed toward an unhurried, meticulously guarded return, engineered around one objective, which was a wrist rebuilt to survive the years he is still owed. And then the schedule spoke, and what it announced contradicted every single one of those signposts at the same instant. On the 28th of July, the roster for the 2026 Six Kings Slam was unveiled, and the Spaniard's name sat squarely among the chosen six. Staged across 4 days in Riyadh toward the tail of October, hosted inside the ANB Arena and beamed to the planet by Netflix, the event resists any honest description as a real tournament. Not a single ranking point rides on its outcome. Nothing produced there counts toward an official record of any kind. What it does offer, in genuinely staggering quantity, is money. Every invited player pockets a guaranteed $1.5 million simply for showing up, while the champion departs with $6 million, a figure that dwarfs the winner's check at any Grand Slam ever contested. Sinner has hoarded the last 2 editions of the exhibition. The lighting there is engineered for spectacle, and the payout is engineered to make elite men board long-haul flights in the middle of a recovery they should be protecting. That commitment did not stand alone either. A handful of days before the Riyadh announcement, the Laver Cup in London had already installed Alcaraz as a marquee draw for Team Europe, positioning him beside Zverev under the captaincy of Yannick Noah at the O2 Arena in late September. A sizable share of the tennis world regards that showpiece, for all its team flag theater and bench camaraderie, as an exhibition wearing a competitive costume. Bolt the 2 engagements together, and the picture turns deeply uncomfortable. A wrist that had not survived 1 competitive point since mid-April now stood promise to a pair of high-tempo showcases, bracketing a Grand Slam, before it had answered a single meaningful question on a match court. The hypocrisy layered on top makes the booking sting harder still. Alcaraz belongs to the chorus of stars who have publicly bemoaned the punishing density of the professional calendar, the relentless grind they blame for chewing up bodies and shortening careers. He has also, repeatedly, turned up for lucrative exhibitions the moment the appearance fee is large enough, brushing aside the obvious contradiction with the argument that such events tax the mind less than a genuine 2-week major. Critics have hammered him for that inconsistency before, and the latest signings hand them fresh ammunition. Behind the Riyadh spectacle sits the broader reality that Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth has poured into tennis exactly as it has flooded football, boxing, and golf, financing prizes so vast that even a still-healing champion finds them almost impossible to refuse. The kingdom's record on human rights has drawn heavy criticism, yet the money keeps flowing through the sport, and the players keep answering its call. Lay the chronology out in blunt order and the unease crystallizes fully. Medical voices preached caution across long months. Even the good news, when it finally came, arrived wrapped in restraint. The diary, regardless of any of that, kept swelling with paydays. Somewhere along the path from the treatment table to the signed agreement, the governing priority silently flipped on its head. Safeguarding the body surrendered to cashing in on the name. That inversion sits at the dead center of everything, because a reversal of such magnitude does not simply materialize out of thin air. Someone authored it, and the author was not a person wearing a stethoscope. To see how, the architecture of this operation has to be laid bare. Alcaraz does not govern his own calendar as some solitary figure weighing offers alone at a kitchen table. A compact and ferociously protected circle sets the trajectory of his career, and the gravitational center of that circle is his father, Carlos Alcaraz Gonzalez. This is no peripheral relative watching from the cheap seats. He was a competitor in his own right decades ago, ranked inside the world's top 1,000 back in 1990, before the money required to chase a professional dream simply ran dry. He rose to become director of the Real Sociedad Club de Campo de Murcia, the club his own family had helped raise from bare earth. A racket found his son's hand at the age of 4, because he was the one who placed it there. The scaffolding of the entire career traces directly back to him. Tennis has already witnessed in unmistakable fashion how heavily his word lands when the largest decisions get taken. The irony sharpens when the family's public image gets held up to the light. Their Netflix documentary sold audiences a portrait of a hands-off, gentle father, the supposed antithesis of the overbearing tennis parent, a man who deliberately kept the roles of dad and coach separate so his son could breathe. That same documentary opened the family's private world for the cameras, the mother and father confessing their fears and pride to millions of viewers, turning the recovery and the rise alike into content. A household that presents itself as protective and restrained on screen has, in practice, functioned as the decisive authority over the professional choices that matter most. The gap between the marketed image and the operational reality is exactly where the trouble breeds. Rewind to the closing days of 2025 for the hardest proof of where that authority sits. Just before Christmas, on the 17th of December, Alcaraz stunned the sport by announcing the end of his partnership with Juan Carlos Ferrero, the coach who had shaped him from a 15-year-old prospect into a six-time major champion and the youngest man ever to reach world number one. 7 years of extraordinary joint work dissolved inside a single social media post. What made the rupture so jarring was Ferrero's own reaction, which quietly implied the choice had not been his at all. He admitted in plain language that he would have wished to carry on. Alcaraz's farewell message dwelled on gratitude and shared glory rather than on any reason for the break, leaving the tennis world to fill the silence with speculation. Into that silence stepped voices who knew the family from the inside. Carlos Santos, the coach who had guided Alcaraz through boyhood, offered a reading that cut straight to the heart of this comeback saga. He located the split in a financial dispute and a failure to settle how much time Ferrero would spend traveling the tour, rather than anything that unfolded between the lines of a court. More pointedly, Santos placed the genuine authority precisely where the pattern keeps pointing. In his account, the father is the one truly in command of the coaching setup, while the son would gladly have retained Ferrero for as long as the coach himself wished to stay. Older friction reinforced that view, since reporting from years earlier described a heated clash between Ferrero and the father over a South American swing back in 2023, a disagreement that apparently left a lasting mark. When the individual credited with manufacturing a champion can be discarded while the paternal voice remains untouchable, the location of real power stops being any kind of mystery. There is a further consequence buried in that coaching change, and it bears directly on the danger now. With Ferrero gone, Alcaraz moved forward under Samuel Lopez as his sole voice on the bench, a figure he trusts and respects, but a figure who arrived in that elevated role only after the more senior, more independent presence had been shown the door. A young coaching setup, however talented, tends to hold less leverage to push back against the family that installed it. The one established figure with the standing to argue against an overloaded schedule had already been removed. Whatever restraining influence a veteran outsider might have exerted over a reckless autumn of exhibitions departed along with him just before the season began. Set this comeback against that entire backdrop, and the shapes snap cleanly into alignment. A calendar crammed with lucrative exhibitions is not the offspring of any rehabilitation blueprint. It is the offspring of a commercial calculation. Guaranteed appearance fees, a $6 million lure, worldwide streaming exposure, sponsor visibility burning at full wattage, none of that descends from a physiotherapist's clipboard. All of it flows out of the business wing of the enterprise, the wing the father anchors most firmly of anyone. The choice to wager a still tender tendon on paydays was never born inside a doctor's mouth. Its origin lies at home, and it took its final shape without the medical team steering so much as one turn of the wheel. Absorb the cruelty threaded through that arrangement, because it loops straight back to where everything opened. The very people sworn to shield Alcaraz may be the same ones nudging him toward harm. A mother once stood before a documentary lens and pleaded that her boy not be reduced to a broken toy by the burdens heaped upon his shoulders. Her dread was never aimed at strangers, at rivals, or at a hostile press corps. The pressure haunting her dwelt inside the machinery nearest to his life, the ambition and the expectation and the ceaseless forward shove of everyone holding a stake in his brilliance. That identical machinery has now handed a mending joint, a merciless autumn of long-haul travel and full-throttle competition, with the sternest voice of caution conspicuously missing from the room where the choice was sealed. Here lies the detail that ought to chill anyone who cherishes watching this man play, because the peril is written in flesh and blood across recent history. For attacking players especially, the wrist has proven a burial ground. Juan Martín del Potro once owned one of the most terrifying forehands the sport has ever produced, a weapon so heavy it toppled both Federer and Nadal on the biggest stages. A grim sequence of wrist surgeries hollowed out what should have been a decade of supremacy, and the towering Argentine spent his prime years chasing a version of himself that the operating table had quietly stolen. Dominic Thiem climbed all the way to the summit, seized a US Open crown of his own, and then a wrist injury stripped away the raw ferocity that had carried him up there. The Austrian never rediscovered the force that made him a champion, fading from the elite while still young enough to have owned it. Neither tale is some obscure footnote dredged up for dramatic effect. Both belong to recent titans whose careers were bent permanently out of shape by the exact joint Alcaraz is now being asked to overload before it has been properly tested. Force a healing tendon back into full-throttle warfare prematurely, and the gamble stretches far beyond a disappointing scoreline. The genuine hazard is a relapse that spins the recovery clock back to zero, transforming a setback measured in a few months into a shadow that stalks a player across entire years. At 23, with the overwhelming bulk of a great career still unwritten, every rational calculation ought to tilt him toward waiting. The booked schedule tilts firmly the opposite way, toward exposure and income and the seduction of the arena lights, and it leans there for an identifiable reason. The economics of an exhibition circuit reward the taking of risk, while the economics of a treatment room reward the discipline of rest. Those two incentive structures pull in flatly opposing directions, and a fragile wrist sits trapped in the middle of that tug of war. The money makes the wager stranger rather than more understandable. Alcaraz has already banked tens of millions in prize earnings, layered atop monster endorsement deals with Nike, Rolex, and Louis Vuitton that would comfortably fund several lifetimes. The $6 million carrot dangling in Riyadh, dazzling as it looks, moves no needle in a fortune of his scale. He does not need the exhibition cash in any meaningful sense, which drains away the one argument that might have excused the risk. Stripped of financial necessity, the decision to expose that risk becomes harder to defend and easier to read as ambition and momentum overriding sober judgment. None of this casts the father as some pantomime villain twirling a mustache, and fairness demands the distinction be drawn with care. The affection binding this family together is real and exhaustively documented across years of interviews and film. The pride runs every bit as deep as the love. This is the household that somehow kept a global superstar grounded through a fame that devours most who taste it, the parents their son openly credits with dragging him back to earth every time another fortune drops into his lap. Devotion and ambition, though, can bleed into something perilous once a fortune sits on the table and a body cannot yet advocate for itself. A guardian who wants nothing but the finest for his child can still, armed with the purest intentions imaginable, drift into the posture of a gambler betting with that child's health. Noble motives do absolutely nothing to improve poor odds, so the portrait sharpens into something far more disquieting than a routine injury bulletin. The physicians counseled a slow, patient mend. The commercial apparatus demanded a swift, marketable return. The father presided over the center of that apparatus. The medical team sat well beyond the boundary of the decision. A mother's filmed warning, released for the entire world to witness, now reads uncomfortably like a prophecy nobody inside that guarded circle cared to hear. The live question has shifted entirely. It is no longer whether the wrist has knitted back together. What hangs in the air is whether the people steering this once-in-a-generation career can withstand the gravitational pull of everything that healing suddenly makes possible. The next chapter will not be authored inside a clinic. It gets written under the lights in Cincinnati and New York and Riyadh on a joint that was cleared to heal but perhaps never truly cleared to be spent so freely and so soon. If this pulled the curtain aside on a face of tennis, the highlight packages work so hard to keep hidden. Do not simply scroll onward and forget it. Subscribe to the channel, tap the notification bell, and leave your honest verdict in the comments below, because a debate this sharp deserves your voice inside it. Tell us plainly whether you believe this family is genuinely shielding Carlos Alcaraz or quietly rolling the dice with the most precious wrist in the sport. Stay close over the days ahead, since the swings through Cincinnati and Flushing Meadows will finally expose whose hand truly holds the pen, and every twist of that unfolding story will be broken down right here the moment it lands. His rival's surrender. One impossible without the other. The trophy is legitimate, the achievement is real, and the shadow is permanent. A first title in a beloved tournament will always carry the ghost of the man who could not finish, and no amount of engraving can scrub that ghost away. Look closely and the paradox stops feeling like a trick of language. Sport keeps generating outcomes that resist tidy labels. Moments where triumph and misfortune share a single frame, and neither one cancels the other. Alcaraz owns a Cincinnati title, Sinner owns the reason it rang hollow, and both truths sit comfortably side by side without contradiction. The record book will show a champion, the memory will whisper about a surrender, and any honest witness has to hold the two at once. Everything now points toward another chapter written under the New York lights. Sinner returns resurgent, determined to guard his throne. Hunger radiates off Zverev, who would relish nothing more than gate-crashing a party that once welcomed only two hosts. Alcaraz, wounded and uncertain, must prove his body can still carry his genius. The fragility that surfaced on that scorching Cincinnati afternoon has become the defining theme of the era, a quiet reminder that the players who look invincible are anything but. Whatever comes next, that strange, silent Monday will keep echoing through every result these champions produce. If this untangled the mystery for you, do the channel a real favor before you go. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell so you never miss the next deep dive, and drop your verdict in the comments because I want to know whether you think that Cincinnati crown deserves an asterisk or the full respect of a title fairly won. Share this with the one friend who still argues about it, and stick around because the road to the US Open is about to get far messier than anyone at the top is ready to admit.